I was almost a historian. I've seriously considered being a historian, and while I was in the throes of this decision, I came on the idea that leaders amplify the mistakes. Their mistakes are amplified by the numbers who follow them without question. And charismatic leaders tend to build up followings, power structures. And those power structures tend to be taken over by people who are corruptible. I don't think that the old saw about power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely is accurate. I think power attracts the corruptible. Dune is conceived of as a planet that is totally desert, so that water on it is the metaphor of, say, oil here, very appropriate at the moment. It is a metaphor of clean air, metaphor of water itself, I mean, potable water. And it's a metaphor for the shortages that we are encountering because of overpopulation. And the story is told in terms of people who are recognizable. You'd recognize these people, but they live in a culture that is somewhat different.
I think it makes people uncomfortable, the idea that a human being can become something other than a human being, especially something mindless out of the depths. I'm very heavily imbued with Jungian psychology, so I think that we do have a sense of the mindless animal in the depths of all of us.
But science fiction, when people say science fiction, they automatically go, ah.
Yeah, but I write science fiction for people who don't read science fiction. And people who read science fiction also.
But you were just telling me that you were going after that general readership.
Oh, yes.
But you were frankly a little bit surprised when it went over as big as it did. Why?
Well, I didn't... You don't wait for that. You go on to do another story. And then when it happened big, and I was very surprised by how big it came along.
You've said science fiction writing can have a missionary impact. Could you elaborate on that for me a little bit?
Well, I think it first has to be entertaining, because if it's not entertaining, nobody's going to read it. I put a pot of message in there with a mess of pottage.
What is the message? What is the statement that you're attempting to make here?
Don't trust leaders to always be right. I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person, for all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons. Then power comes to him. He makes decisions. Some of his decisions made for millions of people, millions upon millions of people, don't work out too well.
In a general sense, not in a specific one about Leto and about planet Arrakis, but in a very general sense, do you make this statement because you're disenchanted with the way others are viewing the future or preparing for the future?
Well, I think that our society was formed on a distrust for government, and we seem to have lost that distrust of government. I kid around and I say that my favorite president in recent years has been Richard Nixon, because he taught us to distrust government.
What is it, that government is a shared illusion, and when the myth dies,
yes. the
government disappears?
That's right.
Religion, government, other institutions, do you see them in any way preparing for what Frank Herbert sees as the vision of the future?
No, I have a very passionate concern for posterity. Another thing upon which this nation was founded, with a decent concern for posterity. And unfortunately, posterity doesn't vote. Well, my Arab friends wonder why it's called science fiction. Dune, they say, is religious commentary. The thing that has often been aimed at it is that it's philosophical fiction rather than science fiction. My own view of it is that, okay, we call it science fiction. I think people are responding to leadership overtures out of a very deep-seated, instinctual process that goes back to our tribal roots. When we were tribesmen and possibly evolved into the wise old men who led the tribe, if we lived long enough. And I think that this is something that just comes with the genes. We're born with it.
And it's a very dangerous thing in this day and age, because technology has given us the tools of self-destruction. And if you put those tools in the hands of sick leaders, then we're really in trouble. People come to me and say, and insist that I'm a cult leader and that I'm forming a cult. If they carry it on too long, I finally turn on them and I say, all right, we're going to start a cult. And we're going to Guyana next week, and we're going to start Herbert Town, and you can have the Kool-Aid concession. I mean, Jim Jones is a marvelous example of how nasty a sick leader can become and how that sickness can infect the people who follow. The problem with leadership is that leaders are human beings, and when they make mistakes, their mistakes are amplified by the numbers who follow without question. And that's why I say, think for yourself, ask questions. My fan mail tell me about Dune, that people read it many times, over and over again, and seem to get more out of it each successive reading, which was what I intended. That people are thinking for themselves. I have a fan letter I got here from a 16-year-old who thanks me for teaching him that if he was going to make a life for himself, he had to do that, and he underlined it the second time. He says, I make, underlined, my life. Well, that's very rewarding to a writer, to see that the message got through.
That ain't the way it works, does it, sir?
No, it is not the way it works.
I mean, doesn't it relate, really, don't you start on a base of contemporary understanding or historical understanding and then work out from there?
We look at history, and we look at anthropology. Well, a good reading for you is the number of university courses that use Dune as a textbook. Anthropology, architecture, political science, economics.
How to be either one of the smartest men on earth or one of the most curious who finds out about things?
I'm curious, extremely curious, and I became an investigative reporter very early on. An investigative reporter who didn't just react. I wanted to know, I wanted to dig. And that's a wonderful resource. You're continually being educated. You know this. I'm not telling you anything new.
But I mean,
nothing like that. I was a 4-H kid who milked cows in the morning and night, who did all kinds of odd things, like hoeing gardens.
what are your...
I would follow a line of endeavor, a line of reading, a line of interest until I felt I had exhausted it. I started working for newspapers when I was 17, though. I had a summer replacement job for people who were on vacation when I was 17 on a daily newspaper. I was very lucky. I had a high school instructor who ran his high school journalism class the way a city desk is run. So by the time I was 17, I knew how to be a professional journalist. And if you catch us young, you know, train us early.
But there's something about your imagination, the special vocabulary that you've created. It's what I think the literary critics call the leap of imagination. It goes beyond just step 1 to step 2.
Well, I've done many things. I have a very checkered career, and I've looked for jobs that taught me things. I've been a speechwriter and researcher for a United States senator, for example. That's where I learned politics. I was a ghostwriter for Sam Hayakawa. That's where I learned semantics. One of the places I learned semantics, I already knew something about it. I was a newspaper writer for years with an investigative reporter's nose. I'm a believer in the high energy life. I just say we have to shift from non-renewable energy to renewable energy. And we have to start taking the steps now. We really do have to start taking those steps now. This is what we're looking at. The federal government says we have 40 years, approximately, of fossil fuels. Now let's say that their figure is accurate, give or take 10 years. That is not a significant figure until you start looking at the depletion, until you start looking at what happens when you're halfway there, what happens to the price of the remaining fossil fuel. We have the latitude to do enormous changes in this society. We have the energy resources to make these changes. However, these are not simple changes I'm talking about.
No, they're not.
No, they're not really simple changes. We're just going to have to bite the bullet on some things and say this is going to cost us. I say frequently that I do not want to be put in the position, I refuse to be put in the position of having to tell my grandchildren, and I have grandchildren, I'm sorry, there's no more world for you. We used it all up.